Welcome again to Jabber's Gospel Thoughts and more Old Testament. So, I'll continue today with the book of Judges. I foolishly thought that I can finish the whole book of Judges in one podcast, but apparently it can't be done. So, today we continue with part two and hopefully the final one of the book of Judges. Now, I get very excited about Judges and First and Second Kings because they are the closest as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would get to understanding the pattern of apostasy and restoration, apostasy and repentance and restoration that we see in the Book of Mormon. And we see how it was prevalent in ancient Israel. And we get to understand that the message of the Book of Mormon, that this is sort of the Nephites and the Lamanites just continue the patterns that prevailed in ancient Israel. They take it from the old land to the new land, to the Americas, and they continue pretty much with the same patterns. So I'm always fascinated by these two books, but I'm also fascinated by some of the stories. And I don't want to leap over many of them. Maybe in the book of First Kings and Second Kings, I'll leap over some of the kings that will be mentioned. But in the book of Judges, it's really worth it to go through all of them and discuss some of these stories because we'll see different patterns that will emerge again in the kings of the northern kingdom, which is Israel and Judah. So yesterday, or in the previous podcast, I stopped at Gideon. His name means the breaker, and he was probably the last great judge. And great is a very relative word here. Because if there is one thing for sure in the history of Israel, is that when God raises kings and monarchs to rule, they don't do it 100% right. Even Josiah, the great king, doesn't do it right. David, of course, we know that he wasn't by far perfect. He, not just the story of Bathsheba, his failure with his to condemn his son Amnon for committing incest with his half-sister, and many other things. Solomon, of course, starts out very promisingly. Well, I wouldn't say promisingly. Relatively speaking, he was promising, but then he commenced to do everything contrary to his own wisdom that we have published. So, and it happens with these judges; they are not perfect. And Gideon is the last great judge in the era of judges. And what we read about him in the end of chapter 8 is that he achieves a victory again. The people of Israel fall into apostasy. They go after Baal and Asherah. The Lord sends enemies against them. They cry for help. He sends Gideon this time. And so Gideon comes in, he defeats the enemies, defeats these two characters, Zebah and Zalmunna, and executes them. He wants his son to execute them, but the son wouldn't do it. And so he does it himself. And then in verse 22 of chapter 8 of Judges, Israel wants a king. I think Israel here, all the tribes reached the point where they want to have a strong ruler. They want kings. Samuel isn't there yet to tell them about all the bad things that a ruler would do to them. But they want a king, and so they say, rule over us to Gideon, both thou and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. Finally, they want him to be a king. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. So Gideon is good in that point, that he recognizes that Israel as a holy nation, as a chosen nation, should be ruled only by God. And this is really the point of contention about having kings. That is exactly the point, is that the king of Israel is God. He, Hashem, Shaddai, he is the ruler. No earthly king can take his place. And that's the point. And so, but Gideon, after a huge moment of soberness, a huge moment of testimony, he does again, he falls into the trap of money and power. And so he asks them to give him all the earrings and all the gold. They collected the booty from the Philistines, and he takes them and he makes idols out of them. And so in verse 27 of chapter 8, we read, "And Gideon made an ephod thereof and put it in his city, even in Ophrah, and all Israel went thither whoring after it. Which thing became a snare unto Gideon and unto his house." So he made a turf, and he made some sort an ephod, and he made some sort of idol, and Israel went whoring after it. And thus was Midian subdued before the children of Israel. They lifted their heads no more. And Jerubbaal, which is another name for Gideon, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. And Gideon had 70 sons of his body begotten, for he had many wives. So again, this is one of the trappings of power. A part of it is tribal alliances, but he had many concubines and many wives. And it came to pass in verse 33. So Gideon died. He gets buried next to his father in Ophrah, and then in verse 33 again it says, "And it came to pass as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel turned again and went whoring after Baalim and made Baal Berith their god." So immediately, as soon as, they couldn't wait. I don't understand them. I don't understand why they had such a hold, why those idols had such a hold on them. You can study all the history about the era, the region, the people, but I'm still baffled by that behavior. So then he is ruled by Abimelech. Now we've talked in earlier podcasts about Rehoboam, son of Solomon, who ended the United Kingdom. So here we see a similarity. Abimelech rules, and in verse 4 of chapter 9, it says, Abimelech hired vain and light persons which followed him. So he hired people to follow him. He was not followed by the people necessarily. And in verse 5, he committed the sin that eventually led to his downfall. He murdered all of his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, the sons of Gideon, his father, basically, being 70 persons upon one stone, notwithstanding yet Jotham, so one survived, Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. So Jotham hides himself. And Abimelech, in verse 6, the Israelites get their wish, and Abimelech is made a king. Abimelech isn't as good as his father. He doesn't realize that that Jehovah, that Hashem is the king of Israel. And he basically becomes the king by the plane of the pillar that was in Shechem. And so Jotham shows up. He went and stood in verse 7, stood up on top of Mount Gerizim, lifted up his voice and cried and said unto them, Hearken unto me, ye men of Shechem, that God may hearken unto you. So then Jotham comes in and he tells this allegory that is really strange. And this is one of the things about this later part of the book of Judges. It has this, in the King James, it has this excruciatingly difficult language that makes it really hard to follow. I usually have to read a different translation and then come back to the King James because the language is really hard to follow here. And so he tells him this allegory about 3 kinds of trees. Jewish commentators think that these trees, Jotham is referring to the great judges that preceded Gideon. And he says, all of these people refused to be king, and now you get this person to be king. And after he says his prophecy, he concludes by saying in verse 20 of chapter 9, and this is reminiscent of Abinadi in the Book of Mormon, what he will do next, what Jotham will do next. But if not, let fire come out of Abimelech. So he said, if he deals truly, in verse 19 he says, if he deals truly and sincerely and with his house this day, then rejoice ye in Abimelech, and let him rejoice in you. But if not, which he knows is not going to happen, giving Abimelech's, whose name means my father is king, it tells you something about him. He's bragging about his father being king. Let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and the house of Millo, and let fire come out of the men of Shechem and from the house of Millo and devour Abimelech. And in verse 21, Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and dwelt there for fear of Abimelech, his brother. So he runs away from his brother, but like Samuel the Lamanite before him, like Abinadi, I mean after him, like Abinadi and Samuel the Lamanite much later on, he does this behavior that is typical of prophetic people with prophetic roles in ancient Israel. And I said in the previous podcast, the role of the prophet in ancient Israel was separate from the role of the priest and the Levite. Sometimes they were from priestly and Levitic descent, but most of the time they were not. They were just chosen. Some of them were shepherds, some of them were just common people, some of them were worked in the royal court, and their role was to confront power, to confront political power and the people, and tell them what's going on, what's wrong. That was a role, a voice of warning. So he ran away, and Abimelech reigned 3 years over Israel. And then after that, in verse 23, some evil spirit came between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, and the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. And the story goes on. There is this war, there is this fight, there is this battle going on. And in the course of battle, in verse 53 of chapter 9, and a certain woman cast a piece of millstone upon Abimelech's head. They were surrounding a city, and in a siege, you throw rocks, you throw fire, you throw all kinds of things on the attacking forces. And so Abimelech's skull gets smashed. And so he says, he calls hastily unto the young man, his armor bearer, and he says, draw thy sword and slay me, that men say not of me, a woman slew him. And his young man thrust him through, and he died. So if you remember in the previous podcast, I spoke about Sisera, who was killed by a woman. It's sort of a shameful thing in ancient Israel to be killed by a woman. And Abimelech, being the proud person he is, he didn't want to be remembered as someone who was slain by a woman, and so he commits basically suicide by your arm bearer. That's what it is, which is a big no-no in the law. So thus God rendered, in verse 56, thus God rendered the wickedness of Abimelech, which he did unto his father, in slaying his 70 brethren. So the crimes that he committed against his brethren came back at him, and that's why he was killed. And all the evil of the men of Shechem did God render upon their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham the son of Jerubbaal. So there you go. That is the story of Gideon. Then in chapter 10, we have these other judges, these other mishpatim, they call them. You have Tula, he reigns 23 years. You have Yair, he reigns 22 years. And we don't really know much about them other than Tula was from Issachar, and the Yair was from Gilead. And an interesting detail about Yair, which tells you a little bit about him: he had 30 sons and rode in 30 ass colts, and they had 30 cities, which are called Havoth Yair unto this day, which are in the land of Gilead. So they were people of fortune and power and all of that. So they were a different kind of judge. And the children, again, verse 6, this is the verse that keeps repeating, and the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord. And of course they cry, and the Lord raises, this is the cycle, the Lord raises persecutors, and then they cry unto the Lord in verse 10, and the Lord reminds them of what he did for them in Egypt. He's always reminding them. He's always reminding them of his blessings. And so we receive in chapter 11 this new judge. And I want you to notice the degradation in the quality of the judges as time goes by. You have these judges and they have success, but they have some personality issue, and they are not 100%, not even, I'd say, not even 50% obedient or even understand the Lord. So we have this person. His name is Yeftah, or Jephthah, as it's written in English, and he ruled only for 6 years. So he is this person who the chapter starts with a story. He's kicked out. He fled from his brethren, dwelt in the land of Tob in verse 3 of chapter 11. He's in exile, and then for some reason, the elders of Gilead come and call him in, and they say, "Come, save us, help us." So they must have known that he's a powerful person, and he recites to them the history of Israel, and then he goes to war against the enemies of Israel, and that's the beginning of chapter 11. And the Lord delivers lands into his hands, and then they go to war. In verse 29, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, or Yephthah. His name means to open, like as in opening a door. And he passed over Gilead and Manasseh and passed over Mizpah. And so he's conquering, and he goes to the children of Ammon, and he makes this foolish, rash oath. He vowed a vow in verse 30 and said, "If thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hand," verse 31, "then it shall be that whosoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the children of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering." So I don't know if he thought that an animal would come out to greet him. The tradition was members of your household will come to greet you. So maybe he thought it would be a slave, or it would be a concubine, or it'd be someone he can easily get rid of, which we know in the story didn't happen. It was his only daughter who wasn't married, and she comes out, he gets victory, and she ends up being sacrificed. Now, this shows you the spiritual status of Israel. They have mixed with the people that they are fighting so much that their wars are no longer wars to clear the land, as the Lord told them, of these people who have this horrible sacrificial ordinances where they sacrifice humans. They get integrated, amalgamated into the people around them so much that they do human sacrifices, which is an abomination. That's probably most likely why the Lord wanted those people annihilated, because they were just committing all of these abominations in his sight, killing and sacrificing to idol gods humans, sacrificing humans to idol gods. Which, having said that, we tend to do that in our modern times. Maybe not so graphically and violently, but with so much social injustice in the world. I mean, in parts of Asia where people are paid 25 cents for a whole day worth of work, living in shanty homes, dying of disease, malnutrition, all sorts of stuff. It's another sort of modern human sacrifices. I think about that every time I buy a shirt or buy a pair of pants. But what can you do? We're all amalgamated and integrated into this modern society where we kind of support that, whether we want or not. Anyway, uh, politics isn't on my mind, but the comparison was just too strong to ignore. So this is Jephthah, and Jephthah ruled for 6 years, and his daughter dies, he dies, and the Gileadites basically keep having successes, They fight Ephraim. So now there is, in chapter 12, there is this brief intermission or in between Judges where they talk about Gideon, the Gileadites fighting the Ephraim, and we have this, and they basically are fighting against each other, and then that's it, and then it says in verse 7, Jephthah judged Israel 6 years, died. Then there is a succession of judges. So we have Ibzan from Bethlehem, and again 30 sons and 30 daughters, whom he sent abroad, and took him 30 daughters from abroad for his sons, and he judged Israel 7 years. Why is this detail mentioned? It's the Romans did that. If you know Attila the Hun from history, Attila was a part of a deal similar to this in ancient societies. When you conquer a nation, you take some of the sons and daughters of the nation you conquered, and you give them some of your sons and daughters in sort of a weird cultural exchange where they learn the language and they learn the customs and cultures, and hoping that the two societies would be able to work together. That's the closest thing I could think of for this one. And then Ibzan dies, was buried in Bethlehem, and then we have Elon, a Zebulunite, and he dies, buried in Ajalon, and then you have Abaddon, and then they say Abaddon had 40 sons and 30 nephews that rode on 70 and 10 ass colts, and he judged Israel 8 years. So these are all these wealthy judges coming in. These are people of wealth and power and influence, and they have all of these sons and daughters. So I don't know, like the rule of the rich probably is what they are talking about here. And Abaddon, son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, died and was buried in Pirathon, the land of Ephraim. So, chapter 13, we get into this story, and I'm not going to dwell on it. We have this woman, Manoah, and an angel comes to her unannounced. It tells you that she had no sons, no daughters. She's of the family, her husband is, they are Danites. And when we talk about Danites and Benjaminites later on, I'll talk about that. As I said in the previous podcast, the whole thrust of the book of Judges is to show that the tribe of Judah is more worthy than all the other tribes to rule Israel, and that the northerners are evil. Not evil, but they are not worthy to be kings and rulers, and it emphasizes the character flaws. So Samson is probably the dumbest, and I would use the vernacular here, the dumbest judge in the book. He's very thick. I don't know what to say about him other than he was very thick. His name Samson refers to Shemesh, the sun. So it's kind of a pagan name. But his mom, Manoah, an angel shows up to her, tells her she's going to have a kid. He needs to be a Nazir, means to be a Nazarite, a Nazarene, which means that he doesn't cut his hair, he doesn't eat the products or drink products of the grapes, and he needs to be. He can't touch or eat any unclean thing, and there are all those laws of kosher cleanliness in the books of Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Leviticus that I talked about before. And they see an angel. Samson's father is doubtful that it's an angel, but then they see the angel ascend. He knows it's an angel, and he knows his son is a Nazarite. Samson grows up probably not understanding what a Nazarite or a Nazarene is, or a Nazir, because he grows up, he's wanting to marry a Philistine lady, and asks his parents if he can marry her. On the way to see her, he kills a lion, and on the way back he and his parents, he sees that the lion's carcass, of course, the lion dies, so animals come and eat the carcass. So probably nothing is left, and so much time has passed. A hive of bees have settled inside the carcass and they are making honey. So he goes in there, and as a Nazarite, as a Nazarene, as a Nazir, he cannot touch any dead thing or eat anything unclean that has touched any dead thing. Jewish laws are extremely strict about ritual purity, extremely strict. And I don't think I've done a detailed or gone into detail in ritual purity in Judaism, but ritual purity is paramount. And as a Nazir, he should have been 100% Mr. Clean all the time. And so what he does is he eats honey from the dead lion and then turns it into a parable. And then he tells the Philistines a riddle. The Philistines couldn't figure the riddle, so they ask the woman he loved to try and cheat him into telling her. So he tells her, and which I find very strange and stupid at the same time. And then he's angry because she betrayed him. I don't know what he expected. And so he goes and he kills a whole bunch of Philistines. So he is basically a murderer, and he's not killing them for any good reason. And he's probably the lowest grade judge, mashpat, in the book of Judges. And we know the story of Samson and Delilah. He gets captured by the Philistines, and she cuts his hair. Then he kind of repents, or I wouldn't call Samson's repentance. He just wanted revenge. So even in that moment when his hair grew, he wanted revenge, and he ends up killing even more Philistines, meeting in an innocent setting, and he dies himself. And the state of Israel, to this day, they have being surrounded by countries at war with them, probably not as much anymore. But in the past, when I was growing up, there was this thing called the Samson option. Israel has all these nuclear weapons, and I think their policy was, if we get attacked, we'll just nuke everyone. So this is similar. I don't know if Samson is the best example to follow in resolving conflict, but that's Samson. And he's not one of my favorite characters, but what I love about the Old Testament, specifically the historical books, is how honest. It's refreshing. Other books of religion and from other nations tend to glorify their prophets and their spiritual persons. The Jews are very critical, self-critical, very honest about it, and it serves a reason, which is the reason I stated in the beginning. Israel is all of us. They are our example. They are the mirror that we as a humanity look in at and try and hopefully learn and try not to imitate them. They had the good, they had the bad, they had the ugly, and you hope that the stories of the Old Testament would give us insight about the ugly and the bad and help us be good. That's the value of it, and that's why I love the Old Testament. Uh, I'm not turned off by the violence in it. I'm not turned off by the crude stories. There is a lesson to learn in every line of the Old Testament. And so that's why we read it. That's why I go into detail into all of the stories. Then we have a story here, chapter 17, after Samson. Now, degradation, we have no more judges, but we have two stories about other tribes and a Levite priest. And so there is this guy, his name is Micah. Micah, basically the priesthood, this is a time when the priesthood is for sale in Israel. So Micah finds a priest for hire, and the identity of the priest is not revealed in the beginning, but you will be shocked by the identity of that priest. And I'll talk about it in a second. He goes there, he hires a priest, and then he builds idols, and he builds an altar, and he builds all of that, and brings this priest to his town, to Laish. and set up an idolatrous situation. And it says always in chapter 18, it starts with, in those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the Danites sought them an inheritance to dwell in. So anyway, there was no king. It was chaos, and I don't know that the writer wants a king, but probably he did. And so there is this guy, Micah, in chapter 17. He establishes idol worship. He hires a Levite, pays him, takes him to his house. And then the Danites are looking for a place. And again, this chapter 18 is a critique of the northern tribes. It shows them as hooligans and probably not worthy, because what they do, they go to this peaceful place. They are looking for an inheritance. The Danites are looking for a place that they can live in. So they came to Laish and saw that the people, in verse 7, it says, chapter 19, it says, or chapter 18, I'm sorry, it says that the people therein, they dwelt careless after the manner of the Zidonians, basically people from Sidon, quiet and secure, and there was no magistrate in the land that might put them to shame in anything, and they were far from the Zidonians and had no business with any man. So that they come upon these peaceful people, and then they agitate against these people, and they send a spy to the country, and they invade them, and they invade them and they take over them. But then they go to, so in verse 17, the 5 men that went to spy out the land went up and came in thither and took the graven image and ephod and teraphim and the molten image, and the priest stood in the entering of the gate. So they go to the house of Micah. They take all the idols, take all the ephod, take the molten images, and they had 600 men that were appointed with weapons of war. And these went into Micah's house and fetched the carved image, the ephod and the teraphim, and the molten image, and said to the priest. And then said the priest unto them, What do ye? So the priest is saying, What the heck are you doing? What's happening? And they said unto him, this is verse 19, Hold thy peace, lay thine hand upon thy mouth, and go with us, and be to us a father and a priest. It is better for thee to be a priest unto the house of one man. Is it better for thee to be a priest unto the house of one man, or that thou be a priest unto a tribe and a family in Israel? So they are telling him, come be more prominent. Here you're just a priest for one man, one family. Come be a priest for the whole tribe. And there is a reason they are asking this particular priest to be that, and it will be revealed in a few minutes here. So the priest's heart was glad. It tells you something about the priest. He loved it. They appealed to his vanity, to his pride. And he took the ephod and the teraphim and the graven image and went in the midst of the people. So he goes with them. And they turn and depart. So Micah follows them. He goes, chases them, and confronts them. And they tell him in verse 25, don't be angry. Let not thy voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows run up on thee, and thou lose thy life with the lives of thy household. So basically, we're coming and will massacre all of you. So this is Israel on Israel. This is a Jew on Jew situation. And the children of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back into his house. So Micah probably wasn't small potatoes. He was probably from a strong, prominent family. He could afford his own priest and his own altar and his own molten images and all that. And he lets them be. He leaves, and they took the things which Micah had made and the priest which he had, and came unto Laish, and to a people that were at quiet and secure, and they smote them with the edge of the sword and burnt the city with fire. There you go. They committed genocide. And there was no deliverer because it was far from Zidon. So the Zidonites could not come to defend them. They probably had an alliance, but it was far and they couldn't come save them. And then they tell you something about the location, and they built a city, the Danites, and they dwelt there. And this detail will come in handy probably later on when we talk about the tribe of Dan. And they called the city Dan. And the name of the city was Laish at first. And then in verse 30, now, ta-da, this is the big reveal now, very important detail. And the children of Dan set up the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom. Now notice this, the lineage of this person. So now they reveal the identity of the Levite priest. Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh. Now, Jonathan is the son of Gershom. There is one Gershom, and he is the son of Moses, Moses the prophet. So this is a grandson of Moses. And if you look at the footnote in the LDS edition of the King James Version, 30a, it says Hebrew Moses altered to Manasseh. Why was it altered to Manasseh? This is a fascinating detail. The scribes were probably too horrified. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe the great teacher, Moshe the great prophet, Moses the great prophet, has a grandson. They wanted to put a distance between Moses and his grandson. How can a grandson of Moses be a priest, use his priesthood in such an awful manner to be to worship idols? How can that be? So that is the detail here that that comes up, and it's a fascinating detail. And I haven't looked. I every time I read the Old Testament, I pass by this, think about it, and then I never look into the history of how this gets covered. It needs some study and some the Hebrew sources for me to know. And to be honest, sometimes I'm too busy, and sometimes I'm too lazy, and sometimes it's a mix to go and look into the details of how that happened. But I promise I'll look into it, and I'll do a short reel or something, and I'll talk about it, because it's a fascinating detail to me. And this year I'm determined to do it, to get down to the bottom of this. Then chapter 19 and 20, and I think 21, we have this fascinating story about, okay, so this story is about a Levite concubine. So she's from the tribe of Levite, and there was, and again, chapter 19 starts with the disclaimer. And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king of Israel, that there was a certain Levite sojourning on the side of Mount Ephraim, who took him a concubine out of Bethlehem, Judah. So these events are happening in Bethlehem, and the concubine played the whore against him, and went away from him unto her father's house to Bethlehem, Judah, and was there 4 whole months. So he's a Levite, marries this woman, she sins. So now, in Jewish law, if you sin and if it's proven against you, you die. But I've heard several rabbis say that actually that was an extreme rare event, because the rules of witnesses were so tight that it could not happen. Most of the time, people went scotch-free, and it sounds like this situation played out in the same manner. So in verse 3, the husband arose and went after her to speak friendly unto her, and to bring her again, having his servant with him and a couple of asses. And she brought him into her father's house. And when the father of the damsel saw him, he rejoiced to meet him. So probably the father, in Middle Eastern, Near Eastern culture, your daughter comes home, she's left her husband, she's committed a horrible sin, she's probably going to be single forever, there's a scarlet letter on her, and you don't want that. So he naturally was very happy to see him, but he knows that this husband probably is scheming of ways to punish his wife and murder her in a way that's acceptable in the law. And being a Levite, he knows the law, but he doesn't know how the husband's going to do that. And so he comes in, and to make a long story a little shorter, he hosts him, hospitality and is given. And every day the Levite is trying to leave with the wife. He keeps hold of him. He says, no, stay, rest, eat. And the Levite stays and goes on for several days. And then the Levite gets up and leaves and takes the wife, takes the servants, and goes. And he refuses on the way out to stop in Jerusalem, the city of the Jebusites, to get some rest. He says, no, I want to stay with friendly people. I want to stay in a Jewish city. So they keep going, and they basically stop in a place in Benjamin. They stop in Gibeah, which belongeth to Benjamin. Now, in some commentaries, they say this is foreshadowing Saul, because Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. This whole story is about showing how bad the tribe of Benjamin was, and that Saul himself, who you might think is a great king because he was chosen by Samuel, does not come from that great of an ancestor, that great of a lineage. So this is a story targeted at the tribe of Benjamin. And they go into the city, they get hosted by this poor fella, and then the people of Benjamin come in, surround the house. It's similar to the story of Lot. They want to know the man. And that does not necessarily mean that they want to have relations with him or sodomy, even though it might. Nobody knows. As I said many podcasts earlier about Lot, the language is really not that clear, because there is a state of war between in this area at the time. There is no king in Israel. It's chaos. And so maybe they wanted to interrogate him. We don't know. We don't know what happens. So the owner of the house, of course, rules of hospitality says, take my daughter, which is a way of shaming the attackers. Take my concubine, but don't hurt my guest. It doesn't work. So this is where the Levite, who probably didn't know how to punish his wife, his concubine, the Levite concubine, he throws her to them. He throws her to the mob, and they know her. Again, maybe they knew her, they interrogated her, but maybe they had relations with her. And they don't tell you. They tell you that next morning she was just breathing her last. And in verse 27, they open the door, and she's laying there, and her hands were upon the threshold. And so, verse 29, horrific. He takes her, she's dead, and he cuts her to pieces. And he sends a piece to each one of the other tribes of Israel, and he says, this is what happened. I need justice. In chapter 20, in a moment of unity, all Israel arises against Benjamin, refused to deliver up the men of Gibeah. They refused to deliver the criminals. So now it's a tribal situation where I'm not going to deliver my men so that you can kill them. So they're refusing basically to follow the law of Moses here. And then Israel attacks the tribe of Benjamin and almost annihilate them. So there is this complete destruction almost of Benjamin. Every man is dead, and and in verse 41 of chapter 20, when the men of Israel turned again, the men of Benjamin were amazed, for they saw that evil was come upon them. Things got very heated. The flame of the city ascended up to heaven. There was this flame that consumed Benjamin, and just complete a scene of complete horror and destruction. 20 in verse 46 it says, so that all which fell that day of Benjamin were 25,000 men that drew the sword. All these were men of valor. But 600 men turned and fled to the wilderness and to the rock Rimmon, and abode in the rock Rimmon 4 months. And the men of Israel turned again upon the children of Benjamin, and smote them with the edge of the sword, as well as the men of every city, as the beast, and all that came to hand. Also they set on fire all the cities that they came to. Complete annihilation and destruction. Israelite against Israelite. And of course, once that rage is gone, this horrible scene of destruction and rage is gone, everyone feels sorry. This is the state of war. I watch the war in Ukraine nowadays, and just as I watched in my lifetime the war in Lebanon, as I watched in my lifetime the war in Yugoslavia, the previous Yugoslavia, as I watched many, many wars, destruction. You look at these beautiful cities, lives lost, productivity, potential, not productivity, potential, human potential is lost. And I grieve. And to be honest, I don't care about any reasons for starting any of these wars. And I rage at people who support these wars. I rage at the political leaders who choose to go into these wars, because what you end up with is complete annihilation of potential, and you lose time that you could have done so many things, and then you look at all the innocent lives that get lost. So war is a horrible thing, civil war is a horrible thing, and this is what the people of Israel are feeling about Benjamin. So what they do is they find wives provided for remnant of Benjamin. Whoever is left of Benjamin is provided with wives so that they can raise seed. So when Saul later on tells Samuel, I'm just a small man from the smallest family in the smallest tribe in Israel, it's because this happened. I mean, the whole almost the whole tribe of Benjamin gets annihilated, and and so that's what happens, and that's the note that concludes the book of Judges. Complete chaos, complete mayhem, and it paves the way for what comes next in the books of First and Second Samuel, which we talked about previously. Saul, David. We have the United Kingdom, which gets lost at the hands of Rehoboam. It forks out, and that's in the next podcast. I will pick up again, go back to the books of Kings, and I'll juxtapose it against the book of Judges. And don't, that word is a big word, juxtapose. It means I'll put this book of Judges and compare it and refer to it when I'm talking about events in Kings, because we see the same cycles repeat and repeat and repeat with the same devastating effect. And again, like the book of Judges ends with almost the near annihilation of the tribe of Benjamin, the books of Kings end up with the exile of both Judah and the northern kingdom, and almost them going extinct. Almost, I mean, we lose, and I hate to use the term lost tribes, because the tribes were not lost. They just got integrated in other societies, but they did lose their Jewish identity. Uh, but then we have the tribe of Judah that survives, like the tribe of Benjamin survived, and that's who stayed with us to this day. So anyway, it's fascinating to the extreme to me to read these books and learn from them, and I hope you do too. Thank you so much for watching.